Hey, life group leaders. I hope you're having a great week. I'm excited for our lesson this week in Genesis 41 with Joseph once again. I think it's going to be a great lesson this week. Just want to remind you that life groups, they're the front door to biblical fellowship. I mean, you are the way that people will get connected. It's the way that we belong, we believe, we become. So, what you do is important as you prepare this week. Just want to remind you that you're the front door of our church, and what you do matters a great deal. We can't do this without you. And so, thank you all for what you do and the time you spend in on loving our people. So, we'll just jump in, okay? We kind of ended last week with Joseph being arrested, but I'll give you a little bit of background to our story. In chapter 40, verse 1, it says this: Sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended the royal master. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he put them in the prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. Well, that's an interesting detail because Joseph's dungeon, where he was at, was the palace of the captain of the guard. And we learned last week that the captain of the guard was Potiphar. So Joseph spent his whole prison sentence in Potiphar's basement, where they kept all the prisoners. And this is at least 2 full years later. What do you think Joseph is feeling? Despair? Unbelief? Bitterness? I don't know, but Psalm 105, verses 17 through 19, tells us that the Lord tested Joseph's character. As far as we know, God never appeared to Joseph. He didn't have a burning bush. He didn't have a stairway to heaven. But his faith is very much like the faith of that Peter talks about in 1 Peter 2:6. The one who believes in him will not be disappointed. Joseph's got an amazing story of faith, as we'll find out today. Because God upheld Joseph, and something about his attitude caught the eye of the chief jailer. So he made Joseph his top prisoner in charge of serving all the other prisoners. Then Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and his baker, as we said, got thrown into prison, and they had these dreams that disturbed them. God enables Joseph to explain the meaning of their dreams, which then the meaning is then fulfilled 3 days later. The cupbearer gets reinstated. The baker isn't so lucky. So Joseph asked the cupbearer to put in a good word for him with Pharaoh, but once he gets out, the cupbearer forgets all about his promise to help Joseph. Verse 22 of chapter 40, Pharaoh impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had predicted when he interpreted his dream. So Joseph is probably thinking in all of this, finally, my suffering is over. Thank you, God, for getting me out of this suffering. And every time, probably for the rest of the day, that he heard the prison door open, he probably popped up and wondered, is that the cupbearer coming to get me out of here? And then the first day goes by and nothing. And then the second day goes by and nothing. And then he's probably thinking, there's probably some paperwork or something that has to be done here. These things take time, but it's probably going to happen really soon. But after a week, he probably starts to lose any kind of hope that he had. And, it's just pretty bleak for Joseph. So at some point in there, maybe it was a week, maybe it was a month, but Joseph has to face this awful reality that the cupbearer forgot about me. And so 2 more years go by. 2 more years of wondering, where's God? Why is my life unfolding this way? 2 more years where a lesser person would have wondered why they don't ever get any breaks. But one day, everything changed for Joseph. He woke up in the morning and he's second in command of his dungeon. And by the afternoon, he'll be second in command of a much larger jurisdiction. In our text today, we read about how Pharaoh sent for Joseph because Pharaoh had a dream, and the cupbearer remembered Joseph. And so the cupbearer tells Pharaoh about Joseph, and Pharaoh sends for Joseph. Verse 14 in our text today, Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once and was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went and stood before Pharaoh. So roughly after about 4,500 days or so as a slave and a prisoner, this is how it comes to an end. At once, he was quickly brought before Pharaoh and stood before Pharaoh. Verse 15, Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I have heard that when you hear a dream, that you can interpret it. And you're like, oh, here it is, the big moment for Joseph. He's going to nail it, right? Don't mess this up, Joseph, because this is your way out of here. Verse 16, it's beyond my power to do this. What are you doing, Joseph? You just did the other people's... No, don't do that. Keep reading. But God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. Keep in mind that Pharaoh thought that he was a god, and he walked in the presence of other gods. And in the midst of this, what does Joseph do? Joseph goes out of his way to make it clear that the correct interpretation can only be received from God, from Yahweh. Joseph's agenda was not merely to get out of prison. His ultimate agenda was to live for God. Now, hear that again. His ultimate agenda was not to just get out of prison. His life's agenda was to live for God. Pharaoh had a dream about 14 cows that no one could explain. The dream. So Joseph's ushered into Pharaoh's presence, and God enables him to explain the dream as prediction of 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph counsels Pharaoh to find someone wise who will organize and execute a grain storage program. And Pharaoh says, I am looking at that man. And so in one day, Joseph goes from being in jail to essentially being the prime minister of all of Egypt. Joseph spends the next 7 years getting married, having a family, and executing his grain storage system. And then the famine hits. But Joseph's strategy works. God gave him that wisdom, and Egypt is saved from famine and starvation. Here's a little tidbit as we approach teaching. There's nothing in Genesis 41 that gives us any indication that God is judging Egypt for anything specific or any specific sin. When we interpret the Bible, it's very crucial for us to not say anything more than what the Bible says. Sometimes it's fun to speculate. Maybe we might have a guess. But the reality is we don't know why God allowed for this famine to happen or why God sent this famine. But we know that God worked good out of this famine because it sets the stage for God to rescue his people, to fulfill the covenant he made with Abraham, and for Joseph to reconcile with his brothers. Other than that, we're not given any other details about the famine. So here are a few things that I think that we can glean from our text today. The first point is this: the world's wisdom, wise as it may be, doesn't have all the answers. Some things cannot be explained or discovered by human innovation or intervention. It took something miraculous for Pharaoh's dream to be interpreted. Second point, in times of adversity, we need to keep on serving the Lord. In spite of his long delay in prison, Joseph never quit. And like I said at the beginning, Joseph didn't have a burning bush experience. He didn't have a stairway to heaven. He didn't see a Red Sea part. He may have, but we're just not told what it was. But in spite of that, Joseph continued to do the right thing, as I'm sure Jacob taught him about how to follow God. And from Joseph, we learn that sitting in pity on the sidelines is not a part of God's plan when we're hurting. From Joseph, we learn how to navigate victoriously through a world that's both hostile and unfair. Joseph is the exact opposite of a victim. And then what I mean by that is when people say, because life or somebody has treated me unfairly or cruelly, I'm justified to either seek vengeance, or I'm justified to wallow in self-pity, or I'm justified in living selfishly, or I'm justified in being irresponsible. In times of adversity, we have to keep on serving God and not circle ourselves and become selfish. Third point, God rewards faithfulness. Because Joseph remained faithful, God blessed him with the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. If he had been unfaithful during his time in prison and as a slave, we may have never heard of Joseph again. Here's some more Bible trivia for you. Joseph is rewarded for his faithfulness, obviously by being second in command of Egypt, but also in ways that we might not have expected. There is no tribe of Joseph in the nation of Israel, and that's because Joseph received a double blessing, and he gets two portions, which he gave to his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Now, here's what's really cool. Manasseh means God made me forget all my hardships. And Ephraim means God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. What an amazing testimony to God's faithfulness that Joseph, just even in the names of his son, was praising God for delivering him. And so it's just an encouragement to be faithful to everyone in your class when times are hard. And finally, we can point to God as the source of wisdom when called on to address difficult situations. James tells us in chapter 1, if any of us lacks wisdom, we should pray. Joseph refused to get any credit for himself. He gave God all the credit. And in doing so, he introduced Pharaoh to the one true God. Instead of saying, hey, this is what I could do, Joseph honored God. And because Joseph had been faithful to God throughout all the adversity in his life, the Lord would honor him as ruler over Egypt, fulfilling the two dreams that he had all the way back in Genesis 37. So this week I have 6 questions for you. You can pick and choose as few or as many as you like. So here we go, kind of breaking them down like we've done into those 3 categories: the belong, the believe, become. Here are your 2 belong questions. How might knowing that God empowered a prisoner to save a nation open your eyes to what God might empower you to do? Maybe if you have a really good connection with your class and you guys are really good friends, you might want to dig a little bit deeper. This one's a little bit harder to answer. Would a non-believer put you in charge of all of their possessions because of your godliness? So here's our believe questions. With no help of a Bible, a church, or encouraging brothers, how was Joseph able to remain faithful throughout all his trials? Second, how was Joseph's life summarized in Psalm 105? You might want to go there, and specific the part about Joseph is in verse 16 through 22. Do you see any details emphasized in Psalms which you don't see emphasized in Genesis? Psalm 105 is a call to worship God for the things that he has done, and specifically in 16 through 22 is about what God has done in the life of Joseph. And then our become questions. How can we encourage each other to lean on God's presence more regularly and testify to his goodness boldly each week? Just like Joseph did. Joseph was boldly testifying to the faithfulness of God. And then finally, how much time do you give God to deliver you from your trials? Joseph waited years. Do we wait years? If God doesn't answer our prayers in a week, you prayed a week. Appreciate you guys. If, like I said in the beginning, pray for you. If you need anything, please let me know. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you Sunday. Godspeed.